Ever wondered how we got here? From scattered tribes to a truly global civilization? Well, what if I told you we could trace that entire epic story in just a few minutes? That's exactly what we're going to do. We're diving into the key breakthroughs, the big ideas that made it all happen. Okay, so our whole journey really kicks off with one big question. Think about it. Lots of human species have walked this planet, but we're the only ones left. Why is that? How did we, Homo sapiens, end up dominating the entire globe? That's the question that's going to guide us through this whole story. So here's how we're going to tackle this. We've broken it down into 5 parts. First, we'll look at the basic toolkit for building a civilization. Then we'll get into the power of pure ideas. After that, it's all about the rise of massive empires, what happens when they break, and finally, the game-changing disruptions that created the modern world. All right, let's jump into part 1, civilization's first blueprint. We're talking about the absolute must-haves, the foundational tools that let us go from being small, wandering tribes to, well, something much, much bigger. And the crazy thing is, this wasn't just happening in one place. It was popping up all over the world, almost at the same time. You've got farming in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Egypt, some seriously advanced plumbing over in the Indus Valley, and river taming in China. It's like everyone, everywhere was figuring out the same big problems of how to survive and grow. But out of all those early breakthroughs, one was the true game changer: agriculture. Seriously, this is the invention that let us stop wandering around and finally start building. Once you have a staple food source, you can have permanent homes. And those permanent settlements, they grew into the very first cities, the real engines of civilization. Okay, but as soon as you have cities, you've got a brand new problem, right? How do you keep thousands of people living together from, well, going crazy? You need rules. And that's where guys like King Hammurabi in Babylon come in. He created one of the first ever written legal codes. And wow, it was direct, an eye for an eye. But see, that wasn't just about simple revenge. It was this radical new idea that the state, not you personally, was in charge of justice. Social structure was another huge tool in the box. Just look at ancient Egypt. It was basically a perfect pyramid. You had the pharaoh, a literal god king, at the very top, and everyone else had their specific place, all working to support him. It was this super rigid hierarchy that let them get everyone organized to do unbelievable things, like, build the pyramids. So that brings us to our second big leap, the power of ideas. Because once societies got the whole survival thing down, they could start thinking about something deeper. The question wasn't just, how do we stay alive anymore? It became, how should we live? And a perfect example of this is ancient Greece. You've got 2 famous city-states that went in completely opposite directions. You have Sparta, which was basically a society built from the ground up for one thing: war. And then you have Athens, which was messing around with this totally wild new idea called democracy, where citizens, well, free male citizens anyway, actually got a say in how things were run. But of course, not everyone was on board with democracy. The philosopher Plato, he thought it was just mob rule, total chaos. His big idea was that the perfect state should be run by a philosopher king, someone super wise who rules based on logic and reason, not whatever the popular opinion of the day is. And honestly, that's an argument we're still having today. Meanwhile, over in China, you see a similar kind of philosophical split. On one hand, you have Confucianism, which is all about social order and harmony. Everyone knows their place, everyone knows their duties. But then you have Taoism, which is totally different. It's focused on finding inner peace, about going with the natural flow of things. It's really about looking outward to society versus looking inward to nature. So all these ideas about how to run a society, they really set the stage for our third chapter, the rise of empires. This is the part of the story where rulers take those blueprints and just scale them up, way up. We're talking about conquering huge territories and ruling over all kinds of different people. So how'd they pull it off? Well, a lot of the time, it wasn't about having the biggest army. Just look at Alexander the Great. His forces were outnumbered almost 3-1 by the Persians. But he won. Why? Because of brilliant strategy and new military tech. He completely crushed the Persian Empire and redrew the map of the world. But okay, it's one thing to conquer all that land. It's another thing to actually hold on to it. The Renaissance writer Machiavelli summed it up perfectly. He basically said it's much safer to be feared than loved. And for a lot of emperors, that was the playbook. That cold logic, that fear of punishment, was how they kept huge, diverse populations in line. But it wasn't all just about fear and armies. Over in the east, you had the Han Dynasty. They unified China not just with soldiers, but with Confucian philosophy. They also figured out how to make silk, this incredibly valuable material, and then they established the Silk Road. This was a massive trade network that linked China with Parthia and even Rome. We're talking about a kind of ancient world globalization here. But here's the thing about empires, they don't last forever. So what happens when they crumble? Well, that brings us to part 4, faith, fracture, and feudalism. This is a time when the old world order just shattered, and something new had to rise up from the rubble. And look, the fall of Rome wasn't some single dramatic event. It didn't happen overnight. It was a long, slow collapse over almost 200 years. You can see it here. The empire gets split up, the city of Rome itself gets sacked, which was unthinkable, and then finally, the last emperor in the West is just gone. And this collapse, it left a huge power vacuum in Europe. And something had to fill that void. And what stepped in were 2 incredibly powerful new faiths. First, you have Christianity. It went from this small, persecuted group to the official religion of the Roman Empire. Then, a few centuries later, Islam emerges, uniting the entire Arabian Peninsula and building a massive new empire of its own, stretching all the way from Spain to India. So with no big empire around to protect people, a new system had to be invented. And that system was feudalism. Think of it like a pyramid of loyalty, but decentralized. The king gives land to his nobles, and in return, they promise to fight for him. And down at the bottom, the peasants work the land in exchange for protection. What's absolutely fascinating is that the same idea, the same solution to chaos, popped up completely independently in both China and Europe, centuries apart. Okay, this brings us to our final chapter, where things get really crazy. This is a period of massive, world-shattering change that basically destroyed the medieval world and paved the way for the one we live in now. This is forging a new world. And the first major disruption was a plague, the Black Death. I mean, the scale of this is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Maybe 200 million people died. But out of that absolute horror came a totally unexpected twist. Suddenly, there weren't enough workers to go around, which meant that the survivors, the peasants and laborers, actually had power for the first time. They could demand more. The next big shakeup was geographic. For thousands of years, you had 2 halves of the planet that didn't even know the other existed. Then in 1492, they collided. Columbus's voyage connected the world, but it also led to the conquest of the Aztec and Incan empires and kicked off this new global system, one that was interconnected, sure, but also incredibly unequal. And finally, the last big disruption was a change in how people thought. This quote from Michelangelo, it just nails the spirit of the Renaissance. He's saying the statue is already inside the marble, he just has to free it. It was about way more than just art and science. It was a whole new way of looking at the world, a new belief in what humans were capable of. So when you step back, you see this cycle playing out over and over again. Innovation leads to stability. Stability lets things get bigger and more complex. That complexity eventually leads to a fracture, a collapse. And then, out of that collapse, new ideas pop up and start the whole thing over again. It's a cycle of building, breaking, and rebuilding. Which leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? Looking around at our world today, which part of the cycle do you think we're in right now?